Hello and welcome. This is Daira Talk. Last week, African Union had invited the government of Ethiopia and the government of Tigray to a peace talk that was meant to take place in South Africa on the 8th of October, which was welcomed by both parties. But soon after the announcement, it was reported by various medias that the proposed peace talks were postponed due to logistical problems. What these invitations were sincere from the get-go. Is African Union impartial to lead this peace process? My guest today is an international expert. He got his PhD from University of Minnesota. Molla, thank you so much for coming here.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, let's start with your reflection on these events. Do you think the invitation was sincere from the get-go?
Whether or not the invitation was sincere, I think the answer to that question can only come necessarily from the African Union, specifically from the person that wrote the invitation. That's the Commissioner of the African Union Commission, Mr. Moussa Faki. But on the basis of some facts that we have, and on the basis of the prior history of the African Union with regard to the war on Tigray, I think we can make some educated inferences about the sincerity of the peace talks. Now, the Abiy government, in its somewhat ambiguous embrace of the invitation, claimed that this invitation proposed by the African Union was consistent with its previous position. But the fact of the matter is that the government of Tigray, leaving aside the fact that it has repeatedly made its commitment to a peaceful resolution of the conflict clear, on September 11, 2022, the government of Tigray had issued a statement which, among other things, reaffirmed the following. First, its strong support of a robust AU-led peace process. And second, its willingness to abide by an immediate, negotiated, that is mutually agreed upon cessation of hostilities to be followed by a negotiated ceasefire, and ultimately, of course, an all-inclusive political dialogue to resolve issues underlying the conflict. And so, having issued that statement, the government of Tigray was awaiting the African Union's response and also the Abiy government's response. Instead, the Abiy government and the African Union remained deafeningly silent. They never provided any kind of reaction, except for the African Union's reaction to the effect that it welcomed our position and our commitment to a peaceful resolution of the conflict. But beyond that statement, the African Union did not take any kind of practical steps to make sure that the Abiy government came to the negotiating table. And so the invitation, which came about 3 weeks after we issued that statement, the government of Tigray issued that statement reaffirming its position on the peaceful resolution of the conflict, did not make any kind of reference to that. And so the fact that the Abiy government is claiming that its position is consistent, the invitation is consistent with its prior position, is somewhat disingenuous because it had remained deafeningly silent to the government's Tigray's serious proposal. Now, as to the sincerity of the invitation itself, now we can talk about the somewhat sorry history of the African Union when it comes to the genocidal war on Tigray in a little bit, but with respect to this specific invitation, there are a number of problems. First, the government of Tigray, in its response to the African Union's proposed peace talks in South Africa, it emphatically accepted the invitation, that it expressed its willingness to attend the peace talks, but it also asked for some clarifications. So, for example, because of the total siege of Tigray, there is simply no ground and air transportation to and from Tigray. So our delegation cannot simply take the next flight out of Molla to Pretoria. So who is going to arrange flights for our delegation, for example? What about security guarantees for our delegation, both in the air and on the ground in South Africa? What about accommodations? What about the substantive agenda that was going to be the subject of the proposed peace talks? So in the absence of a clear understanding, a complete clarity about the substantive agenda, at the very least a cessation of hostility should have been on the agenda. But the African Union was quite unreasonably ambiguous and unclear about the nature of the peace talks. But as far as the government and the people of Tigray are concerned, because they are committed to a peaceful resolution of the conflict, saying no to this kind of flawed invitation would have, I think, guaranteed that the Abiy government would simply capitalize on it to continue its genocidal assault on the people of Tigray, to use it as a justification and blame us for impeding the peace process. But in reality, it is the Abiy government that has impeded peace talks. In fact, after we issued that statement on this 11th of September, the Abiy government, along with its genocidal partner in Eritrea, launched all kinds of offensives against Tigray forces in all directions. And so I suppose the sincerity of that invitation can be assessed in the context of these facts that I have outlined.
How about the reaction by the former Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta, declining the invitation due to conflict in the schedule, and as well as lack of clarity with regard to the ground rules of the proposed peace talks?
Right. So we have tremendous respect for President Kenyatta. He is a highly regarded statesman, and we appreciate President Ruto for appointing him as his special envoy for the Horn of Africa and also the Great Lakes region. And we expect that President Kenyatta will make tremendous contribution to potential peace talks and their successful outcome. I think the points that President Kenyatta raised in his letter informing the African Union of his decision not to attend the proposed peace talks speaks for itself. The absence of clarity on the rules of engagement. So for example, we had asked questions about who the participants were in addition to the main parties to the conflict, that's the Ethiopian and the Tigrayan governments. And so, and what their role would be on the ground. And so President Kenyatta was simply asking if he were to attend that proposed peace talk in Pretoria or elsewhere, what his basic role would be in that conference. And also the fact that there was no substantive agenda presented by the African Union, specifically cessation of hostilities. As you know, we are in the midst of heavy fighting, in the midst of a brutal and destructive fighting. And so the very first thing I think that usually comes to the mind of rational people in the midst of war when it comes to negotiated settlements is at the very least the fighting has stopped for a moment so that the party to the conflict could take some time to talk about a peaceful way out of this conflict. So I think it's simply his declining of the invitation to attend the proposed talks reflects his understanding that the African Union had not done even a minimum advance work to make these proposed talks a success. And so that's a reflection of it. And an indictment of the African Union's failure, I think, to push the peace process forward.
And there are many observers that have questioned the impartiality of the AU. For example, the president of the World Peace Foundation, Alex Dual, called for the resignation of the president of the Commission, Musa Faki Mohammed, and the special envoy of the AU on the Horn of Africa, former Nigerian President Olusegun Obasanjo. Do you think AU is impartial to lead the negotiation?
It's a good question. We, that's the people and government Tigray, have had considerable concerns about the impartiality of the African Union from the very beginning. As soon as the war on Tigray was declared in November 2020, the African Union essentially embraced the Abiy government's narrative about the nature of the conflict that was going on here in Tigray, essentially accepting the nonsensical idea that this was a simple law enforcement operation, thereby ignoring the multiple violations of internationally recognized human rights and the violation of international human rights and humanitarian law across Tigray. And so we had concern about the African Union, but we subscribe to the idea that African problems can be resolved through African institutions. And so because of our respect for the African Union as an institution, we accepted the role that it currently does have. But unfortunately, the Abiy government has successfully hijacked the AU-led peace process to create the appearance, the impression that it is committed to a peaceful resolution of the conflict. And it hasn't had any kind of serious pushback from the African Union as well as the High Representative for the African Union, former Nigerian President Olusegun Obasanjo. And so on the one hand, the Abiy government is slow walking the peace process. On the other hand, It is claiming in public that it is committed to a peaceful resolution of the conflict. And the African Union and Mr. Obasanjo haven't pushed back against the Abiy government's slow walking of the peace process. And so what we have is a genocidal war that's raging here in Tigray. The people of Tigray are not only assaulted through the air, through the ground, but also the people of Tigray are subject to weaponized starvation. And so we have our essential socioeconomic services discontinued by the Abiy government, and the African Union and Mr. Obasanjo have not pushed for any kind of even elementary confidence building measure from the Abiy government. Now I can give you an example. In February, this past February, for example, Mr. Obasanjo was in Molla, and the government of Tigray responded to his request for a confidence building measure by promising to release thousands of prisoners of war that were being held here in Tigray. And per that promise, in May 2022, the government of Tigray released about 4,000 prisoners of war. And instead of reciprocating the government of Tigray's bold gesture of goodwill, the Abiy government actually denied the very existence of these prisoners of war. And Mr. Obasanjo, despite being rebuffed by the Abiy government, did not make any kind of effort to press the Abiy regime to show any kind of goodwill in order to move the peace process forward. And so, in addition to the prior history of the AU legitimizing what they call the Ethiopian government's genocidal conflict, but narrated as a simple law enforcement operation, and their failure to press the Abiy regime to take practical steps towards the peaceful resolution of the conflict, I think the African Union has, in some ways, failed itself, failed the people of Tigray, failed the people of Ethiopia, and failed Africans who had high hopes that African institutions would take prominent role in resolving African problems.
So, do you think the African Union can lead this process effectively and alone?
If the past is any indication, I think the African Union has a serious soul searching to do if it is going to move us forward and find a peaceful way out of the current conflict. But it cannot simply happen if it continues coddling the Abiy regime, if it continues not to call out the Eritrean government's destructive participation in the genocidal war in Tigray, if it simply ignores the government of Tigray as an essential interlocutor and focuses its interaction with the Abiy government, if it simply asks for something positive from both sides, one side takes that positive step, but the other side doesn't take it, and the African Union stays quiet. Under these conditions, the African Union cannot lead the peace process effectively, because at the end of the day, if it cannot be an honest broker, if it cannot have the confidence of both sides, if it cannot have clarity on what it is that it is trying to achieve and the mechanisms by which it seeks to achieve this peace process, then I think the African Union is going to be ineffective, and thus far it has proven ineffective in getting us out of this conflict.
All right, let's proceed to my question regarding Eritrea. How do you explain the role of Eritrea in this war, in the war on Tigray that has claimed the life of thousands and raises the crimes amount to genocide and impeding the efforts to the peaceful resolution of the conflict? How do you explain the role of Eritrea in this conflict?
The Eritrean government has, since November 2020, been knee-deep in the genocidal war on Tigray. But understanding the Eritrean government's destructive, brutal participation in the war on Tigray requires providing some background to the Eritrean regime's prior history of creating and fomenting instability across the region. Since it joined the international system as an independent state, the Eritrean state has been involved in minor and significant international conflicts, practically with all of its neighbors. It had fought a war with Yemen over the Hanish Islands. It has border conflict with Djibouti. It has border conflict with the Sudan, and it fought a very destructive war with Ethiopia when it invaded sovereign Ethiopian territory from 1998 to 2000. Now, in 2000, it was decisively defeated on the battlefield, and the Eritrean government sued for peace. But since 2000, the Eritrean government, led by the dictatorial Isaias Afwerki, has been nursing grudges against Ethiopian elites, particularly Tigrayan military and political elites, whom he considered to be responsible for the defeat his army suffered on the battlefield. And so his dream scenario, being a very weak and unstable Ethiopia, he has been sponsoring all kinds of insurgencies and terrorist outfits inside Ethiopia in order to undermine and ultimately engineer the violent breakup of the Ethiopian state. Because only a very weak Ethiopia, neither at peace with itself nor with its neighbors, could be a playground for Eritrean intelligence, security, and military officers. Only a very weak Ethiopia would allow Isaias Afwerki to live out his fantasy of becoming a regional kingmaker. So Isaias's delusion of grandeur has led him to foment discord and conflict, not simply in Ethiopia, but also across the Horn of Africa. In fact, in 2009, the United Nations Security Council imposed sanctions on Eritrea for its policy of destabilizing its neighbors. And those sanctions were further strengthened in 2011 by the Security Council for its destabilization of neighboring countries and for its support of Al-Shabaab, the Somali-based terrorist outfit that was destabilizing the region. Unfortunately, those sanctions were lifted in 2018 because apparently when Abiy came to power, Abiy formed an alliance with the Eritrean dictator, ostensibly to end the border conflict between the two countries, but in reality to form a mutual pact of aggression against what they consider to be their common enemy, the people of Tigray and the very party that the people of Tigray elected to represent them here in Tigray. And the international community, unfortunately, was sucker punched, was deceived into thinking that the Abiy-Isaias rapprochement was genuine and not a mutual war of aggression against the government of Tigray and against the people of Tigray. And so the international community lifted those sanctions. And because the lifting of the sanctions freed up resources from the Eritrean government continued its policy of destabilizing the Horn of Africa. And so its participation in the genocidal war on Tigray is comprehensible in the context of its prior history of destabilizing the region. Isaias has not produced a legitimate state. He has not engineered any kind of socioeconomic progress in Eritrea, so he cannot legitimize his rule on the basis of economic development, on the basis of political liberties. And so he has to manufacture real or perceived external threats in order to consolidate his power at home. And his alliance with Abiy is understandable in the context of his desire to consolidate power at home, undermine and hopefully engineer the violent breakup of the Ethiopian Federation, and then assert himself as the regional kingmaker on the Horn of Africa. And unfortunately for the people of Tigray, this sadistic government sent its army loose across Tigray, and this murderous army committed all kinds of heinous atrocities against the people of Tigray, including rampant sexual violence against the people of Tigray, including the weaponization of starvation. Let me just give you a few facts about the weaponization of starvation by the Isaias government. Oftentimes when we talk about the use of starvation as a weapon of war in Tigray, people usually start since the end of June 2021, when the government of Tigray assumed its rightful position here in Molla. But it actually predates that. By the end of May 2021, the United Nations had documented about 130 incidents of humanitarian aid blockage. in which aid workers were harassed, intimidated, beaten, murdered, and turned back at checkpoints manned by the Eritrean and by the Ethiopian government militaries, as well as by Amhara forces. 50 of these 130 incidents were accounted for by the murderous Eritrean army. 50 other incidents were accounted for by the genocidal Ethiopian army. And 27 of these incidents were accounted for by an assortment of ragtag Amhara forces that were roaming freely across Tigray. All right? And so 130 incidents of humanitarian aid blockade. In fact, the Eritrean government's violation of international humanitarian law was so egregious that the then head of the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, Mark Lowcock, publicly singled out Eritrea for using starvation as a weapon of war against the people of Tigray. Unfortunately, the international community did not heed his calls and mete out appropriate punishment against the Eritrean government. And at the moment, the Eritrean government, in collaboration with the Ethiopian government, has launched full-scale offensives in all directions, invading Tigray. And so one can safely conclude that the Eritrean government is almost single-handedly responsible for the complexity of the Ethiopian conflict at the moment and for efforts to bring about a peaceful resolution out of this crisis.
Days ago, there was a joint statement released by 6 countries, including the US, that called the withdrawal of Eritrean forces. Do you think withdrawal of Eritrean forces from Tigray alone can solve the crisis in the Horn?
I don't think it can solve all of the crises that we're facing in the moment, but it would definitely go a long way towards finding a peaceful way out of the current crisis. Because the Eritrean army is knee-deep in Tigray at the moment. It is brutalizing our people. In fact, the Eritrean army is deliberately targeting, for example, the Kunama community in Tigray. The Kunama people, as you know, reside on both sides of the border. It is targeting the Kunama community, including Eritrean Kunamas, that have been forced out of Eritrea as a result of the regime's vicious persecution, and they have found sanctuary here in Tigray. But it is more particularly and more mercilessly targeting Tigrayan Kunama communities, making clear its genocidal intent. It's to eliminate these ethnic minorities, because the Eritrean government has a very flawed theory of state building. The fact that there are multiple ethnicities in Ethiopia that have the right of self-determination, that have the right to survive as a political grouping, is somehow considered problematic on the part of the Eritrean dictatorship. And so by eliminating these ethnic minorities, it assumes that it can bring about a different kind of political dispensation. And so the withdrawal of Eritrean forces, I think, will go a long way towards ending the current conflict, because at the moment, it's not just the Ethiopian government that's fighting Tigrayan forces. In fact, for all intents and purposes, the Eritrean regime is leading. It is the principal architect of the war at the moment. Tens of thousands of Ethiopian army troops are stationed in Eritrea, collaborating with the Eritrean army, being commanded by the Eritrean army to assault the people of Tigray. The very citizens that have historically paid staggering sacrifices on behalf of the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of the Ethiopian state. But at the moment, Ethiopian elites are busy talking about territorial integrity and sovereignty, rationalizing the brutal genocidal assault of a foreign invading army in the name of the country's sovereignty. And yet, the people of Tigray, who are a significant part of this country's storied history, are being assaulted by a foreign enemy that's been invited by the very government that should have protected the fundamental rights of the people of Tigray to survive as a people. And so the withdrawal of Eritrean forces is not enough, but it is a necessary condition for the peaceful resolution of the current conflict.
Okay. Finally, what do you think should be done to initiate a serious peace talk that might lead to the end of this brutal and deadliest war on Tigray?
First of all, the bringing about serious peace talk to end this brutal conflict requires coming to terms with some facts on the ground. The Ethiopian government, along with its domestic Amhara allies and the Eritrean army, invaded Tigray. And that invasion has to be called by its proper name. It's invasion. They have invaded, and the restoration of Tigray's constitutionally recognized status quo ante is an important condition for initiating peace talks. So among other things, this means the withdrawal of all invading forces from constitutionally recognized Tigrayan territory. That's one. And the second is because our enemies are using starvation as a weapon of war, allowing unfettered humanitarian access to the people of Tigray would go a long way towards creating conducive conditions for the peaceful resolution of the conflict. At the moment, our enemies are not just bombing us, both on the ground and through the air, but they have also encircled the people of Tigray in all directions. They have suspended essential socioeconomic services. They have prevented the entry of humanitarian aid to Tigray. And so under these conditions, the people of Tigray are being asked to negotiate with the enemy under the enemy's terms.
Okay, so what should be the role of the international community in this regard, in ensuring the entry of the humanitarian access and in checking all these warring parties to go into table?
The international community simply needs to stop coddling the Abiy and the Eritrean governments. The international community has access to a robust package of policy tools that could incentivize the Abiy government and the Eritrean governments to withdraw from Tigrayan territories and to press the Abiy regime to allow unimpeded humanitarian access to Tigray. But the international community, if it cannot call out, for example, what's happening in Tigray by its proper name, that is aggression, invasion, genocidal assault, then it can't prescribe appropriate policy solutions to bring the problem to an end. So the international community needs to press all the invading forces to withdraw from Eritrea. And the people of Tigray are sick and tired of statements of concern coming from various quarters in the international community. Statements of concern are welcome, but statement of concern alone would not do anything to advance the peace process. And so we need the international community to take strong actions, including sanctions, against the Ethiopian and Eritrean governments to allow unimpeded humanitarian access, to restore discontinued services in Tigray, so that the people of Tigray, for example, can have access to their savings. We're not presenting a precondition. This is a fundamental right. If you deposit your money in a bank, you should be able to withdraw your money from the bank. But as you know, millions of Tigrayans who have tons of money in the bank are otherwise exposed to extreme hardship because they have no access to their own savings. And so for the international community to threaten strong punitive actions against the Eritrean and Ethiopian governments, I think would contribute potentially to the peaceful resolution of the current conflict.
Okay, Molla Reda, expert in international relations and comparative politics. Thank you so much for showing up. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.